This presentation and paper emerged from several bouts of field research that I conducted in a rather small central Italian province where I've been spending my summers studying asylum seekers reception centers since 2016. The objectives of that research at large were twofold. On one side, I wanted to study the EU border regime from the margins, if you wish, rather than asking what happens or in which ways is asylum denied, for example, through military surveillance across the Mediterranean or indeed the Atlantic, through bilateral agreements with Turkey and Erdogan, through funding of militias like the Janjaweed. Actually, my research wanted to ask a different question. What happens when asylum is granted? What happens to those who manage, in spite of all this, to reach Italian shores and who are in the system, in the asylum reception system? What can that tell us about the EU border regime at large? And the second objective was really to try and reframe narratives about the crisis away from abstract relations or logics, whether we think about containment or logistification or neoliberal capitalism, privatization and exploitation, but rather to chronicle the crisis as something that spreads across society, as something that is across society, that does not happen out there in an ontological world exclusively populated by borders and migrants, but really that affects us all in different ways. Okay, so on those bases, I approached the central topic of this session, i.e., the study of development in place, by thinking about the ways in which asylum and development are rendered concrete in this small central Italian province of Macerata. And I want to do so by thinking about one particular place, a group of 4 housing units where about 10% of the total number of asylum seekers in Macerata resided between 2017 and 2019, and to unravel 3 trajectories of combined and uneven development that intersect in those housing units as a way of fulfilling the objectives of this panel and session. So I will try to do 3 things in the remainder of this presentation. Very briefly introduce the context of my research, the Macerata province and asylum infrastructure in Macerata province. Then, as said, I will zoom in a group of 4 houses where asylum seekers resided, and I will collect various stories and histories intersecting in their rooms. Finally, I should have about a minute to draw implications and to speak more directly to the topic and central concerns of this panel, so that the Q&A session that follows hopefully can start a more productive basis. Okay, so let me start from context. The area shaded in red that you see in this slide is the Macerata province, one of 5 provinces in the Marche region of central Italy. Ancona, at the top of the slide, is the regional capital, and this is a short hop away from the Croatian shores, about 200 kilometers, just to give you an idea. The stars that you see in this slide represent the exact location of the extraordinary reception centers at the heart of my research. They're called CAS in Italian, from their Italian acronym. These were instituted in law in 2015 as a way of coping or supplementing the capacity of the reception system for asylum seekers that was instituted until then. Although they're called extraordinary, they were in fact a very important institutional setup for during the crisis, hosting up to 70% across Italy of the total number of asylum seekers residing in the Italian peninsula. So there were 65 of them between 2017 and 2019, hosting about 1,000 asylum seekers. The overwhelming majority of them was in Macerata city, the provincial capital, and you won't see them at this scale, although they are recorded in my Google Map account. I want to talk about more in the reminder of these presentations are these 4 that you see over here. Well, you see probably just a bunch of stars, but there are 4 housing units, all located in the same estate. So here they are, 4 housing units at the center of these analyses. What can they tell us about migration and development? I'm going to try to develop these 3 trajectories of uneven development through 3 questions that characterize my research, my ethnographic research, or in fact, my institutional ethnography of asylum seeker reception centers. And the questions are, first, how do you get there? How come people coming all the way from Afghanistan, Nigeria, Gambia, Bangladesh end up in a place like this? Second, what are these housing units? How have they been transformed into asylum seeker reception center? What was there before? Third, who lives there and what kind of stories do they bring with them? Let me start from the first question. How do you get to a place like Macerata if you are an asylum seeker? This slide kind of summarizes the main routes or trajectories of forced displacement, state-organized forced displacement that bring migrants reaching European shores, or in fact Italian shores, to a place like Macerata, a tranquil province in central Italy. Okay, 3 main ways. The most important one is certainly the interception in so-called search and rescue zones of migrant boats, which would intercept migrants, disembark them in one of approximately 4 or 5 locations across the south of Italy, where migrants turned into asylum seekers would be fingerprinted, medical checks conducted, a first registration taking place. According to a rather complex allocation mechanism of which I speak elsewhere, these migrants would then be dispersed across the Italian peninsula, ending up in several asylum seeker reception centers, including those in Macerata province that I studied. Now, I think this is important because it speaks about the subordinated inclusion of European peripheral countries like Italy or indeed Greece within the EU apparatus. Dublin regulations say that the country of first arrival is the country responsible for managing asylum seekers, for adjudicating upon their asylum claim, and for issuing temporary or more permanent protection statuses, or indeed for voluntary returning them to their place of origin. And this subordinated inclusion explains other routes that were used to forcibly relocate migrants into Macerata. For example, quite a few of the asylum seekers I spoke to there had actually made the journey north, escaping from the reception system in Italy and reaching places like the Netherlands or indeed the UK. If they were unlucky to be detained and arrested by local police, a simple check in one of the EU databases would identify them as people that had lodged an asylum claim in Italy, or rather that had left the finger in Italy or in Sicily, as one asylum seeker told me, and would be again, through complex mechanisms, forcibly relocated to to Italy and then dispersed across the peninsula. Similarly, some of the asylum seekers / irregular migrants were detained and arrested in one of the border crossing points into Austria, Switzerland, or France. Here again, internal Schengen borders, which are in principle open, were somewhat either officially suspended, like France did for a long period, or were racialized in the sense that police would detain only black and brown people to check their documents. Okay, so although the story is much longer, the point I'm trying to convey here that the European space, the European asylum system is not homogeneous, and the incorporations of countries like Italy and Greece within the asylum system clearly speaks of an uneven process of EU project and its development of a supranational apparatus. Think about Greece and the relation that the management of asylum had with the management of their debt at the time of Syriza, and you get a sense of that uneven incorporation into the EU institutional apparatus. Second point, what else can these stars tell us about development? Here, well, I'm trying to complicate the understanding of asylum infrastructure as an exclusive expression of the EU border regime. Don't take me wrong, I mean, these are indeed 4 stars and are crucial sites for the management of asylum seekers. But they're not just that, they're also housing units that have been in that same location for a long time. In fact, that were transformed into asylum seeker reception centers, but had a much longer history. Here, one can think of the history of the state in which they are incorporated. This is a photo from the 1970s that depicts only one, the one that in the previous slide was at the top left, of the housing units. This is an estate that has been in the hands of the same aristocratic family since the end of the 15th century, when this is a family whose origins are in Tuscany, but they crossed the Pennines and bought about 100 acres of land as a hunting ground that was later converted into an agricultural estate, as much of the region was considered the granary of the Pope. Until the late 19th century, all central Italy was still under the papal system. The family survived the advent of the Kingdom of Italy, indeed prospered during the fascist ventennio, and throughout the Republican era continued to prosper, to produce crop, and to rent, ameliorate, in fact, take advantage of EU funding for tourism to ameliorate and redecorate the housing units that were occupied by asylum seekers in 2017, 2019. So the point I'm trying to make here is perhaps similar to the one that Ilaria Giglioli makes in the case of Sicily. We cannot think about the so-called differential inclusion of migrants into a European or indeed Italian space without accounting for the uneven trajectories of state development of Europe or indeed of Italy. Being an asylum seeker in a place like Macerata, or indeed in one of these 4 housing units, is rather different than being an asylum seeker elsewhere. For sure, the administrative and legal procedures that regulate everyday life are exactly the same. They're instituted in Italian law and European directives. And yet, the experience, the possibility of for example, work and being exploited in agricultural fields is rather different. I mean, the history of the province means that several aristocratic families still own large tracts of land. There are former church land holdings now administered by trusts, who are the largest landowners of the area. These large agricultural estates mainly cultivate hay and sunflowers, and they are largely mechanized, which means that there are less opportunities for asylum seekers to be exploited compared to other places in Italy. Or indeed, the location of this center in rather peripheral areas within the province means that even getting a shop in one of the many Chinese small factories and assembly plants, or in any of the shops or other employment opportunities that are available in cities or towns in the province, is far more difficult. Once again, the point should be developed much more extensively, but I wanted to complicate the understanding of asylum infrastructure to include the legacies of uneven processes of Italian state development. The final point that one could make responds to the third question that I mentioned before and relates to those that live in those housing units. Who are they? Where do they come from? And again, this slide is rather interesting. These stars show the exact point of departure of asylum seekers who wanted to share their story with me, and clearly indicate what we generally define as the difference between the global north and the global south. All these areas, Macerata was quite peculiar in the sense that there were hardly any Syrian or Middle Eastern asylum seekers, and the overwhelming majority was from West Africa and Central and South Asia. But if you listen to the stories of migrants themselves, what we now call the afterlives of empire emerge very clearly. Take Elias, an asylum seeker from Nigeria, from Delta State, Nigeria. He was talking about his village and characterizing it by reference to evangelical and missionary schools and churches that have been present since the time of the colonial enterprise. Similarly, he was telling me that the only legal employment opportunity in the village was effectively to work in the rubber plantation that was first established during British colonial times. If I remember now stories of people coming from Kurram Agency, from areas across the Afghan-Pakistani border, and they were speaking about aerial bombardment, killings, weddings being destroyed by attacks of foreign armies in ways that were clearly reminiscent of some of the colonial accounts that I read for my previous research related to Afghan refugees in Pakistan. So here, global patterns and trajectories of global and uneven development contextualize at its broadest the asylum seeker infrastructure that I speak about. And it is precisely the intersection that in this very brief 3 or 4 minutes I wanted to discuss, so that I can try to formalize a series of points. So I realize I'm over time, so let me get straight to the point. What I've been trying to sketch is a sort of institutional ethnography, if you wish, of asylum seekers' reception centers, whereby I try to study up from the ground the various forces, relations, dynamics that explain what these infrastructure are, what happens to them, how are they transformed into asylum infrastructure, and who lives in those places. And through this rather sketchy and rather rushed institutional ethnography, I've been trying to isolate or perhaps identify 3 trajectories of uneven development that intersect in the rooms of these 4 housing units. And these trajectories speak of the uneven incorporation of European peripheries into the EU project. They speak of the uneven incorporation of Italian regions and provinces into processes of Italian state development. And they speak of the uneven incorporation of areas across the world into patterns of capitalist development. So, what does this institutional ethnography tell us? Three main points.
First, we should reject banal understandings of the relation between migration and development, such as those that are expressed in EU documents and that find in instruments such as the EU Trust Fund their policy expression. We will not diminish migration by bringing development over there. Rather, a lot of scholarship from the 1980s already demonstrate that the opposite is quite true. Second, I wanted to complicate understandings of the EU border regime. Right, recent scholarship have offered very interesting theorizations of the EU border, but these theorizations tend to focus exclusively on the dialectic between migration or migrants and border regimes and border controls. I think they miss an appreciation of the significance of development trajectories for understanding how the encounter between borders and migrants actually unfold. Third, and more directly speaking to the concerns of these panels, I wanted to suggest that studying migration and development from the ground up, in other words, in place specific ways, allows us to theorize from singularities. It allows us to capture broad processes of global development, while at the same time accounting for the peculiarities, dynamics, and indeed contingencies that render concrete that relation in place-specific settings. I think theorizing from singularities would be, well, the main thing I would like to discuss in our Q&A. Thank you very much.